Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next panel for our Regulated Industry Summit. My name is Troy Leach. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Cloud Security Alliance, and it is my pleasure to introduce a panel that helped to create a really fascinating report. We conduct this every 3 years. It's the Financial Services Survey on the adoption of cloud and now AI within the industry, looking at market trends, where the comfort level is with the technology as it relates to also the regulation and other type of complexities that happen in financial services. So before I begin, I would love to take a moment and have our panel introduce themselves. Sophia, I will start with you.
Pleased to be here. I'm Sofia Pogrebinska from PayPal. I'm IT and Cloud Officer at PayPal, and I've been a member of Cloud Security Alliance Leadership Council since 2022. I'm really pleased to be here and discuss these important topics with you.
And also Sophia and Keith are part of our Financial Service Leadership Committee as members in leadership positions in financial services, as the title suggests. Next, Mark, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Mark Bauer. I run product and go-to-market for a company called Anjuna Security. We're in a domain called confidential computing, which we'll touch a little bit on today. But I also co-chair the confidential computing working group for the CSA in the privacy organization. So really excited to be here and to go through the survey.
And Mark and I have known each other probably over 20 years or close
I
to at this
think
point,
so.
with other
Yeah.
standards bodies and other standards we've helped to create over the years. Keith, over to you.
I run a team of cybersecurity examiners at the Federal Reserve, where we go in and try to do our best to ensure that our financial institutions are, operating things from a safe and sound perspective. And the insights of the data of the survey was great because it really provides a great lens on things. So I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Keith. And just a little accolade. Keith does a great job of advocacy throughout different federal agencies, making sure there's some coordinated education on some of these cybersecurity matters. So glad to have you with us, Keith. And I'll actually stick with you with the first question. We're looking at the industry having the saturation. About 98.3% of financial service organizations say that they now operate cloud services, very similar to our 2023 report. But now 64% are saying that they're storing or processing regulated financial data within public clouds, and another 18% plan to do so in the next 18 months. So we're seeing about 4 out of 5 financial service organizations agree that this is a good practice going forward. I'm just wondering, how has cloud become this assumed architecture, and what has changed most to make that possible? Is it the confidence in the security controls? Is it somehow the greater clarity that's come from regulators, maybe more mature offerings from cloud providers, or is this something else, Keith?
When I was thinking about this, one of the things that we've really seen as the survey shows is that cloud infrastructure really is just a part of the IT ecosystems of our financial services industry. That's really become very evident in the last few years, whether it's the architecture, the engineering, the infrastructure, whatever. In terms of there's some of the reasons why, maybe from a regulation standpoint, the message has been sent that we treat cloud just like we used to with the on-prem days, right? We expect the same kinds of operational resilience and governance processes and all those sorts of things to be in place. But when I was thinking about just some of the trends, I see that our institutions and any industry for that matter just really are comfortable now with the cloud, the technologies, the offerings, the ability to secure. They have had longer term relationships with these providers. So that comfort level has allowed them to move in. I think you kind of pair that maybe a little bit with what I've seen in terms of availability of talent and skill sets. It's always going to be an issue to have enough talent for people to put together these environments, but whether they're homegrown or acquired through new additions to these companies, they've got a lot of access to great cloud architects and engineers and developers who are familiar with the technologies to put all these things together. But I think the big driving factor in the last 2 years, we can't say anything right without saying artificial intelligence, right? When we think about our financial services organizations and we think about their use of things for back office efficiencies, their use for real-time fraud detection, using it in anti-money laundering kinds of operations to trace things. There's just so many things that our financial institutions can use in the AI space, and we know AI requires cloud, so hence those numbers pushing up, and you're seeing key datas and key business applications out there in that environment now.
I've seen that with some of the central banks that were a little bit resistant to cloud adoption, but now they see that they need that cloud infrastructure to be part of the next world, next generation of technology with AI. And we do see some interesting forms of the banks being very conservative traditionally with their adoption of technology, but a little bit more forward and more aggressive with their adoption of AI. And maybe that is because they've had other iterations of AI through the years already. Mark, looking at some of the risks that come with this, the third party and supply chain was seen in the survey to be the top concern. 55% of the respondents said that was a concern. Misconfiguration still up there at 52%. How are financial institutions reducing their risk, and are they redistributing that dependency across just a different complex chain of cloud and SaaS providers, as well as what Keith started to mention, the AI model providers and the networks and agent ecosystem?
What it comes down to for a lot of it is to touch on what Keith has said, and the first question as well, is that when you think about this kind of the resilience of organizations and that supply chain risk, at least now you also have some regulatory frameworks which allow you to measure some of the controls requirements to kind of meet, the resilience regulations that we've seen in the EU that have started to emerge in the United States. But when it comes to kind of the supply chain risk, we've seen breaches over the years that have been quite substantial, whether it's from a credential leak into something like a GitHub, which is a really big problem, or if you have a third-party software that you don't trust or infrastructure that you don't trust. What it comes down to is kind of the notion of trust and control, which in a cloud environment you always have that shared responsibility model, and then it comes back to, well, where's the liability kind of stop and start? And one of the things that's changed over the years as well, organizations, I think, in the enterprise space becoming more acutely aware of zero trust approaches. That includes for looking at agentic stacks and agent governance, and how do you bring zero trust into that kind of environment where you've got all sorts of complex trust issues. But fundamentally, when you think of that supply chain risk, it often comes back to how do you prove that what you expect to be running in a target environment is precisely and exactly what's running, and then be able to approve that from a regulatory perspective. And so this comes back to notions of kind of how do you measure something? How do you measure trust and not have trust that's a leap of faith or hope, which is not measurable? And so we've started to see what I'd kind of couch as controls equivalents that you have in the cloud now, especially through trust technologies like confidential computing, where you can quite literally prove that what you're about to run in an environment, first of all, you can prove the environment itself is isolated and trustworthy. You're not having to make that leap of faith of the kind of hope. And then what you're running, you can prove precisely what you're running. And so therefore, you can start to move away from dependencies of unexpected code, unauthorized code, maybe even unauthorized infrastructure. And I think this is also helping organizations drive more workloads to the cloud by having much better trust mechanisms. And when you think about how to kind of bring this into an AI context, when you've got high scale, you've got incredibly valuable models and incredibly valuable data, having hardware-based trust anchors, which the report particularly called out, is a really essential tool to start to underpin the security that's not just for running the code and the data isolated that runs models and things like that, but to prove trust end to end from the start of the build to the process of actually executing that, and then having the ways to verify that. We've seen this kind of over and over, and in particular when it comes to things like running, say, proprietary AI models. If you want to run those in infrastructure that you don't trust fundamentally, perhaps in a geography that you don't trust, how can you do that? And that comes back to these kind of new hardware trust anchors and confidential computing approaches, which are unlocking this kind of capabilities without increasing risk for organizations.
Sophia, Mark mentioned regulation. And so be remiss not to mention you being in Europe. You've probably heard DORA more times than you can recall. But I'm curious, it came up quite a bit in the report as one of the top influential regulations. And I'm just wondering how regulation like DORA starts to influence some of the cloud's strategy for these organizations that when we say that nearly half of the respondents said that they shifted their cloud strategy in the last year.
Well, I'll share my experience. I've been living and breathing DORA for the last couple of years. As you know, 2025 DORA went into effect, and for those just joining us, DORA, Digital Operation Resiliency Act regulation in Europe. DORA is very prescriptive comparing to some other regulations. Some other regulations may be a bit, principle based, but DORA is very prescriptive in it. Really, risk management framework and in other RTS, it does set out a very specific requirements that financial institutions need to adhere to. Now, how does it connect? I was thinking a lot. How does that connect with the strategies that financial entities maintain with respect to their use of cloud, as opposed to before DORA? So I'm thinking about the way I like to think about it is in the context of resiliency. In principle, to put it really briefly, choice of the cloud service providers and the cloud strategy isn't really a procurement conversation, isn't a money decision. It's not only an architecture decision either. It's not only a decision based on security controls. One of the important factors now is operational resiliency. And what I mean by that, financial entities need to know what are the important business services that they're running. In Europe, it's called critical and important functions. Now, every institution, every bank knows that they have a list of critical and important functions. And then they need to define and map to the to the technology that underpin those critical and important functions. And they need to make the kind of decisions they need to make. So let's say, right, we're thinking about migration to cloud. One of the questions can be, what are the providers behind it? So is it Google Cloud? Is it AWS? Is it another cloud provider? What are the subcontractors? So we need to analyze the full supply chain. So we need to know what are the subcontractors and what happens if one of the elements of the supply chain actually fail. Do we have strong contractual controls? Have we tested it? And all those aspects really come together when the financial entities think through their cloud strategies. And I'm not saying that resiliency always comes from multi-cloud, right? Multi-cloud can, in some cases, reduce the concentration risk, but it also can introduce some challenge in terms of security controls and consistency and other questions. In the end, I think these are main drivers that make financial entities sometimes make financial entities reconsider their cloud strategies. Although I observed as well, and I agree with Keith and Mark, that security controls and actually a use of AI, in fact, sometimes drive faster adoption of the clouds in financial industry. But the operational resiliency is one of the drivers as well. To what extent the entities can respect the rules and regulations, and pretty prescriptive regulation. It also kind of matters.
We have this added complexity now of AI and these third-party providers of whether the model or agents that might be embedded in some of the SaaS offerings and things of that nature. The survey covered a lot on AI adoption and moving into the comfort level that financial organizations have with autonomy of some of the agents that might be running. In fact, the report showed that 43% of respondents are in active implementation or advanced AI adoption, with another 49% in exploration or pilots. And what really stood out in this report is that 62% already said that they were using AI agents, possibly for chatbots and other functions, maybe within their SOC, but that among them, 38% had already granted some conditional or even high levels of autonomy to those AI agents. So, what is clear is that the autonomy is advancing. And I'm curious, Sophia, what controls and frameworks or other types of assurance mechanisms are regulated industry or regulated organizations, I should say, putting in place now for their adoption of AI agents?
Well, there are lots of frameworks to rely on. There is ISO, there is body of work developed by CSA as well. I can say that this is very helpful too. In Europe, there is AI Act, something that sets out requirements as to how financial entities can manage AI and what are the boundaries of what they can actually implement. I like to make analogy to like real world scenarios. If I have a junior manager in my team, and junior manager takes the data and moves it somewhere where it shouldn't be, or does something else, against the policy, who will be responsible? I think I will be responsible. The officer of the bank will be responsible for sure. So for AI agents, it's quite important as well to set the boundaries. What is permitted, what they can actually access. What are the limits? What is the permitted actions? Who is checking it? Who is verifying what they're doing? And who is accountable? So I think those. But of course, there must be an audit trail. There must be security controls. We must build in all the best practice and follow the regulation. But also we need to ask ourselves, this is more the autonomy governance, let's say, rather than security controls. But of course, all the best practice in terms of security applies.
Yeah, and one of the things that CSA has recently adopted from Josh Woodruff is his agentic trust framework, which builds on some zero trust controls. And to what you're saying, treating these agents as almost human identities and give them more junior intern type of expectations and tasks and limitations, and then as they prove themselves, then build up greater autonomy and greater privilege access. And so it's something that if people are interested, we'll put a link for the Agentic Trust Framework, which is working on right now. But speaking of identities, Keith, you and I have talked very recently, actually, on identity and access management. And one of the big things is around non-human identity. And in the survey, it was interesting. NHI was cited as only 24% as one of the top 3 risks for organizations. But this is even as these service accounts, API keys, the machine certificates, all of these automated workflows and the AI agents themselves are expanding very rapidly. I'm wondering, is the industry itself underestimating the machine identity risk, and should agent identity now be treated as like a first-class IAM object with this, very observable delegated authority, time-bound permissions, and other types of controls?
I have to admit, Troy, it was definitely one of the more eye-opening statistics to see in the survey. I think, regardless of the industry, I see that we're all kind of dangerously underestimating the non-human identities, especially what is it? It's like 100 to 1 versus our human actors in the terms of the number of these identities that we have out there. I'll say whether you're approaching things and looking at operations across organizations from an audit perspective, a regulatory perspective, one of the big things that you always see are these AI agents, API keys, these service accounts. They're generally always like overprivileged in terms of their access. And you think about how they're accessing all your key data, which I know we'll talk a little bit about later. It's definitely one of those things that's eye-opening. And if we think about how we do credential management, we think about our governance processes that we have in place. it's kind of really a big blind spot out there. We're also used to these. Oh, we're going to do a quarterly review or an annual review of our human actors and go, oh, does Joe still work here? Does he work? Oh, he does. Oh, does he work in the same department? Does he need the same privileges? And maybe we have some automation that helps kind of support that manual review. But now do that review with 100 times more of those human actors, and that kind of governance and oversight's just not happening. So to your point, Troy, yeah, we really need to start thinking about moving these things to being their own kind of first class IAM object. Start, ensuring that we delegate the proper scope and authority to these accounts from a least privilege perspective, right? A tried and true risk control that we've had for years. Time bound, all of these accesses to just in time access or some sort of short lived access, and ensure that the permissions are immediately removed upon the completion of the task. Making sure that we have the right monitoring tools to look for anomalous behavior and maybe have some kill switches in place to kill these things. And then, obviously from an audit or a regulation perspective, that we have comprehensive auditability, that we have granular listings of and immaculate listings of audit logs so that we can really trace all these decisions and all these places and things that all these non-human identities are, actually making decisions and doing in our environment. So pretty surprising to see that risk hasn't really resonated yet with a lot of our survey respondents.
Yeah, and to add to that, Microsoft has come out and said, in what they've observed in their annual trend reports is that even with Copilot, more than half of the issued Copilots are over permissioned and have probably greater access. And this is something that we struggled with for not just years but decades, and so now we are getting into a much more complex environment where agents could possibly be permissioning other agents autonomously, and so having that visibility before there's an incident is really important. Speaking of incidents, I don't want to say that any of the respondents lied in this briefing. They probably just were not aware, but one of the data points, someone that used to do forensics, was that 20% of the respondents confirmed that they had an AI-related security incident, and that really does not necessarily mesh with a lot of the general surveys, not financial service specific surveys. Another 21% said that they were unsure, but the reality was a good portion of the respondents were just skipped the question altogether, and that could be either they were uncertain in the matter or they were worried that they might be audited as a result of the response. So Mark, I'll turn to you and ask, how big of an issue is that the ability to confidently identify, classify, and track AI-related incidents, especially when agentic AI may be involved in the future and doesn't look like a traditional user or system. How should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, and I can guarantee that it's definitely not like a normal human based on the customers we work with and the research we've been doing. And I think the survey response comes back to exactly what Sophia said earlier, which is the responsibility would come back to her for those kind of incidents, right? And so maybe there's a sense of plausible deniability by not answering the question. The way we've been thinking about this, and we often get a little bit of a giggle when we describe this, and reflecting what Keith said, when you bring out agents, they're very, very powerful. They can resolve problems by being given a mission, right, and figure out how to get there. And that creates all sorts of potential pathways to solving that particular problem. And that becomes non-deterministic in many ways. And we've seen agents do things that are very unexpected. So we almost think of this as having the capacity of a very powerful, say, 1,000 interns fresh out of college, very, very capable, very enthusiastic, but given root access to systems and told to solve problems. And so if we had that, we would have a kind of a supervisory mechanism and a mentoring mechanism and policies and rules and guardrails to try and bring that power under control to get things done and to tap into it. It's a powerful capability. We have to think of almost agents in the same kind of ways. I'll give you an example, to lean in on what Keith said about kind of the credentials and identities and things like that. We use these models today where we have humans involved, where you can make kind of a value judgment on, am I being responsible, or am I being malicious, and do I have ways to detect that? With AI agents, it's a little more difficult. And even with some of the common coding agents, so a lot of customers have started with things like coding agents because it's so powerful. You can accelerate development, QA, and so on. They're probably not realizing that as that agent is accessing even the local laptops, it's accessing things that are there, which might be in hidden environment files. Client, you might have credentials sitting there. And what we've been seeing is unexpected behavior of just sucking credentials off systems, which then go back into LLMs, and you don't know where that goes, and you don't have control over that. That's just one dimension. You unleash agents now with access to tools and that can reason and discover and maybe even propagate themselves by creating more code that then they run. You start to introduce a really big problem, and that comes back to then the notions of trust and control. And I think it is definitely a challenge for organizations. A lot of them are still figuring this out, but you need to have kind of a different governance model that is capable of tracking with the agents, understanding the kind of the context that they're working in, just as we would with those interns, so that we can actually guide them and say, hey, go back down to earth a little bit here, solve the problem this way, don't have overreaching access to data. And by the way, just because you've got a scope that lasted 5 seconds and you accessed a database here and you're accessing the same thing again 3 seconds later, don't just assume that that's trustworthy. You have to evaluate the context and the risk. And so that leads us to kind of new kind of governance models that I think we've sought after in the human world, but they themselves can be driven by AI, which is the only way to probably scale, which then brings us back to trust again. And so you have to think about this kind of very holistically. But I think we're starting to see these kind of new governance models. And maybe with those, organizations will have better visibility into the incidents that are happening, whether it's coding agents or something else, and then have ways to actually mitigate that and bring things back down to earth, but without sort of just blocking and tackling, which is the traditional approach, which really doesn't work for organizations for the most part.
Yeah, Mark, you mentioned that quick interaction and still continuously having trust and almost a zero trust like methodology. And that reminds me of one of the projects here at CSA. We have the Autonomous Action Runtime Management framework that was donated to CSA. It's freely available in our lab environment, and it tries to do that in that memory area where there could be potential poisoning, making sure that there's context, policy, intent, behavior that is happening, and be able to identify each of those and record it as such. Keith, I'll come back to you as the concern and risks we've talked about. One of the top concern of any type of risk was data exposure. Having some type of leakage of the sensitive data over any of the other type of prompt injection and anything associated with model text. 61% said, this is the most important thing, more than the model drift or adversarial techniques. Of course, the survey was conducted right before Mythos was announced to the world, so that may have influenced our results. And I'm curious to very quickly do another survey that will compare. But why is that? Why is it that the industry is so concerned about that risk over maybe some of the technical risks associated with AI models?
I think there's probably a couple of reasons behind why data just seems to jump to the forefront as the major risks that our financial services folks will focus in on. Some of it comes from regulators, right? One of the big focuses of ensuring safety and soundness of their operations is all about the data, the customer's data in particular, and ensuring the security and the safety of that. So you kind of have that particular pressure. And then you add on to that the fact that we do have regulations like GDPR, GILBA, and CCPA, where there are financial penalties, and guess what? That's a measurable statistic, and it's kind of a mature sort of statistic that all of our financial industries are used to having. So that's something that you can measure versus thinking of things like model drift or prompt injection or model theft, or how do you quantify that and put something on it? So it just kind of lends yourself naturally to going, oh wow, I've got metrics, I've got statistics, I can really focus in on those things related around data. So I think those are kind of the places from a regulatory perspective, regulations, the maturity, and the fact that you have real metrics is really what puts that pressure on why we're concerned about the data, why we're concerned about all the various different things from RAG connectors and SaaS, embedded SaaS AI features, et cetera, that's getting access to the data. Eventually, like you said, it would be interesting to see with Mythos, has that changed a little bit? Are people now starting to worry a little bit more on the technical side? But historically, kind of data has been positioned for those factors as to why it rises to the top.
And with that Mythos paper that we published that had over 250 CISOs look at it, review, and give some form of endorsement. If people haven't seen that report, one of the things that we talk about is kind of the change of those metrics and where security metrics, KPIs, are probably this year needing to dramatically change. In financial services, we know that sometimes takes some time to progress. And so I'm encouraging CISOs today to be looking at that paper and looking at the type of metrics that they may need to think about if there is more rapid weaponization of more zero-day vulnerability type of exploits being discovered. Sophia, last question before we do a quick speed round for everybody. One of the questions we threw into the report or into the survey was around the expectations for AI agents in payments. And it showed that 85% expect that AI agents to initiate and execute financial transactions. And 65% of those respondents believe that this is going to require some form of new authorization model, because just thinking about how today's instruments are always assuming that a human is present and confirming the transaction. And now maybe this agent will be doing one or both sides of the transaction themselves autonomously. So with this agentic payments on the horizon that's already live or piloting with many organizations, what actually has to hold for an agent to safely transact on behalf of either a consumer or on behalf of a business?
We've covered a lot during the conversation. I just wanted to go back to the initial idea that as financial entities in Europe think about introducing these new technologies and introducing something like that to the market. A lot of peers in the industry, and I'm hearing this through the work groups, a lot of financial institutions think about it through resiliency lens. How does this impact? And it's a good thing. The DORA requires a certain controls, and the intent of the regulation is not just to increase the level of control and how we do these things. The intention is the resiliency of the financial industry. As we introduce in these technologies that introduce something that make our lives easier, help us use more innovation, and many other benefits. How does it impact actually the resiliency of financial industry as such? And I think now when I think about it, of course, clear accountability is important. We've covered the ongoing monitoring. We've covered the dispute and errors. We've covered the kill switch, great idea, something goes wrong. Full auditability and non-repudiation, data minimization and privacy controls, which I think a lot of entities already, at least operating in Europe, GDPR applies, so technically a lot of financial entities already have some controls in that space, and similarly CCPA and similar regulations in other locations. Then one of the items is that like fraud and AML and all those, sort of controls should be applying to transactions initiated by the agent in a similar way. It's just in the same way as it applies to human transactions. Well, I think we've covered the human in the loop if the transaction is high risk, either a human in the loop when humans should be stepping in. What should be enforced through some machine controls like policies, code, etc., strong authentication, and what are the boundaries actually? Again, which agent is permitted to do what, when, and who authorized them? What do we have an audit trail of that? And who is accountable for it ultimately? Those are no easy questions, and there is no easy answer for it. Well, thankfully, some of the frameworks that I've been seeing lately are really helpful to get a good grip on it.
It's one of those things that, being in payments myself, I think dispute resolution is a big part, and you touched on that of is it going to be agents discussing with other agents whether the legitimacy of a transaction. And I think you've also highlighted that even though a transaction itself might be technically simple, the location of the person that might be buying something, that in any type of local jurisdiction for preventing that type of sale, as well as the age. I know if I was a mischievous kid and wanting to get something, could I manipulate my parents' agent to buy something on their behalf? I think you've pointed out a lot of really important social as well as technical issues that we have to be thinking about. So now that we've covered this, we're going to do one quick question lightning round around the conversation of, with all that's going on, and what should we be investing in? So we're integrating AI security into cloud environments. It's that was in the report stated as the number 2 priority at 44%. At the same time, the report showed that budget limitations and the lack of AI expertise are both the leading barriers at 45%. So if each of you, you had a magic wand and you had one proactive investment to make in the next 12 months that would make the most or reduce the most risk without slowing adoption, what would it be, and why does the market keep identifying these capabilities as priorities while sometimes underfunding them in practice?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. And there's a couple of angles to this too. I think, when you look at the backdrop of where we are, we're getting to that point where we can take an idea, we can get it out to market really fast with AI, right? So vibe coding and things like that. And so you need a mechanism to be able to just launch those ideas, test them, and so on, without then a systemic security risk. So, the biased from my perspective, obviously, from coming from the domain, but it's quite in all seriousness, confidential computing is a powerful technology that helps with that trust and that isolation. But I think with the investment question, the real thing that we see a dilemma around right now is you've got, on the one hand, you've got the business pressure to must use agents, and everybody's trying to get them out as quickly as possible to boost efficiencies, to reduce costs, to accelerate time to market. And on the other hand, you've got all the risks that we've talked about that have started to emerge. And you can't stop that. You can't say no. That's a career limiting decision at this point. And so I think organizations have to think about, well, how can I get a view of what's happening with my agents? How can I start to govern them and unleash that power? Because agents are very diverse. They can be in the browser, they can be on the desktop, they can be vibe coded in a minute. They might come from third parties, but you need to be able to tap into that, but with some degree of control and assurance across them to meet compliance requirements, to treat them like digital employees, to bring DORA or other compliance regulations visible to organizations, and then start to govern and control them, and to do that in sort of new ways. And so I think this new tier of agentic governance is a very powerful way to unlock that value without starting to introduce all the systemic risks from both a visibility, from a cost, from a data access, and from a credential perspective that ultimately would limit the success of projects. And I think that's probably the number one that we would recommend.
I think this is my chance to say that I've spoken too much about compliance, but I'm also part. I know I tend to speak a lot about compliance because it matters. I think it's the right thing to do as well. It can bring a competitive edge, but you know what else can bring competitive edge? I'm a part of cybersecurity organization as well. I care about trust. I care about trust, if we're building trust for our customers for every transaction. And I think if it were for me to invest, I would definitely leverage Gen AI capabilities for systematic security, different security capabilities. That help strengthen the security controls and improve in generally the resiliency posture. I think that's it's no secret that the bad actors are using Gen AI at scale, and I think every security organization is now investing in somewhat in this direction as well.
And Keith will give you the final word.
Yeah. So first, I'll jump on the soapbox of the why, the underfunding. I think it's an age-old cybersecurity problem, right? You've got the business who's got this neat new technology that can help the bottom line, right? Whether it's reducing costs or generating revenue in some way, and they see security as being that cost center. So it's a battle that we will always continue to have to remind our business partners that, hey, security enables business. It's not a blocker if done correctly. So if you were to ask me to invest in something, I would probably pick some sort of like an AI security posture management type of tool that allows you to continuously automate your inventory and your governance, and discover those things like shadow AI, and help you with your data lineages, and flag those overprivileged pipelines of things that may happen. To me, that seems like that's a tool that can kind of fit in without stopping adoption of AI, and kind of naturally fits into your cloud ecosystem.
Yeah. Well said. I think that's something that people are trying to build. How do we create that observability and also accountability for ourselves as well as the AI technology that we deploy? Well, with that, I want to thank our panel for joining us in this Regulated Industries Summit talk. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as well as the chat that's been going on, and look forward to our next time that we all get to meet and talk about all things related to AI and cloud in regulation. Thank you, everyone.